Sure.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Speaker. If you wish to experience peace, provide peace for another. If you know you are safe, cause another to know that they are safe. If you wish to understand seemingly incomprehensible things, help another to understand. If you wish to heal your own sadness or anger, seek to heal the sadness or anger of another. Dalai Lama.
Thank you. Review and adoption of the agenda. Notification of absences. As mentioned, Mr. Jacobson won't be joining us for personal reasons. Same with Miss Chinna. I believe she's traveling today, and hopefully she could join us. Maybe we'll try to get in contact with her here. Declaration of conflict of interest. Section 77, brackets 1 of the Legislative Assembly and Executive Council Act. As it arises, I guess. Decisions on in-camera. We do have a few items further down the agenda, but we'll move into camera when the time comes. Item number 3, public items. We have Mr. O'Reilly that has questions on interpretation, translation, inquiry. I'll turn it over to Mr. O'Reilly. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, there's a memo in your package that I prepared. It starts on page 3. I think it sets out my situation fairly clearly and with a bit of background and recommendations for you. So I'm not going to read this, but I'm going to try to highlight that for you, Mr. Speaker. So, of course, as members of the Assembly, we all have the right to use any official language in the Assembly. And I guess it's the issue is it's not clear who covers some of the costs that may be associated with that. And I'll get into some of the details here in a minute. So I think the real issue is whether the costs of using official languages, whether those should come out of the individual MLA constituency work expense allowance, or they should be considered as part of the normal operations of the Assembly and be charged to the Assembly itself. So just a little bit of background for you. There's an appendix to my memo. I think I've made 10 statements in the House in French, and I go and get those I write them out in English. I get them translated into French for me, and then I speak in French in the House. Sometimes I ask questions of ministers, but generally I ask the questions in English so that they're more clearly understood. But and I think the appendix also outlines that I've been involved in 3 news releases that I had prepared myself that were translated into French, and a couple of group ones as well. And I guess in the last Assembly, all of the costs of that interpretation work, and I don't think these are really large bills. I think they're generally about $100 per statement or a news release. But in the last Assembly, all of those costs seem to have been picked up by the Assembly itself. And I've only actually seen invoices a couple of times recently in February of 2020 for a member statement, and then again in November 2020 for another member statement. And anyways, I just wasn't clear to me whether these costs should be picked up by the Assembly or by myself with the constituency work expense allowance. So I did turn to look at some of the policy and legislation that we have in place around translation and interpretation and the costs thereof. And Section 102 of the Members Handbook says, that's found on page 2 of my memo. Members may also be reimbursed for costs associated with research and writing services and interpretation and translation services and other relevant professional services. Another section of the members handbook talks about it's section 141.2 that written translation services where reasonable and practicable will be provided upon request for designated documents in any of the official languages. Designated documents include but are not limited to the orders of the day, bills or bill summaries, amendments to bills, motions, and committee reports. So it doesn't specify member statements, but certainly member statements are on the orders of the day. And I think that section of the members handbook might reasonably be interpreted to include member statements. News releases, perhaps, but certainly member statements, I think, should be included there. And then, of course, we had the report from Rules and Procedures on the matter of privilege that was raised when Mr. Lafferty was Tlicho interpretation was not made available to him, and he raised a point of privilege. The Rules and Procedures Committee, which I chaired at that time, made a report, and there was a number of recommendations in that report that I think are relevant to the discussion here today. And I'm not going to review those in any detail, but I guess the issue here is that there seems to be an inconsistent approach in terms of invoicing of the costs related to translation services. And my couple of recommendations here, Mr. Speaker, was requesting that the payment of the October, November translation invoices from my office, that those charges be reversed and assigned to the Assembly itself. And that there may be a different kind of interpretation, perhaps of the rules of in the members' handbook than what I've received recently, and that further work on this be done in the context of the response to the Standing Committee on Rules and Procedures to actually develop a broader policy on use of official languages in the Legislative Assembly. And that's it for me, Mr. Chair. I know that your next agenda item is actually the beginnings of the response to that Rules and Procedures report and the recommendations therein. And I don't want to jump ahead, but I see that there is to be a policy developed in the second quarter of 22-23. And I hope that it would deal with this issue of the costs of interpretation and perhaps clarify that. But I think there's probably room within the existing rules that we have in place now for those costs to be picked up by the Assembly themselves as part of the normal operations rather than through the constituency work expense allowance. So that's it for me, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the chance to present this to Baum, and I'm happy to answer any questions that members may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Does the board have any questions for Mr. O'Reilly? We will be dealing with this little on our next action item, all right? But if anybody has any questions, feel free.
Mr. Speaker?
Yes.
I just wanted to confirm with MLA O'Reilly that it wasn't until 2020 that he was charged for any interpretation cost, and that during his previous term with the 18th Assembly, I just wanted to confirm that he was not charged at all for any interpretation costs. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cleveland. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks,
Mr. Speaker. That's my understanding. I asked my constituency assistant to go back and check, and we don't recall ever receiving an invoice in the 18th Assembly for any interpretation costs. So thanks. Yep.
Thank you. Any further questions? Seeing none.
Mr. Speaker, I have some questions, but they're for staff, not for Mr. O'Reilly. So I'm wondering when you would like me to ask them. Thank you.
Yep, sure. Now would be good.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm wondering if staff are able to speak to why there was it's seemingly a change in how interpretation was handled. I know that even for myself, when I have chosen, when I have chosen to speak in, on occasion in French in the house, I've done the translation on my own, but have had the opportunity to learn some Clicho from translators, and on those occasions have had an opportunity to have items translated just by sitting with interpreters between breaks and having that done, during session at that time. And so I'm wondering if staff can kind of speak to where that transition happened and if it is something that they envision being a hard policy from now on. Is that charging of members? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cleveland. Ms. Bunnell?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just for everyone's information, my name is Nicole Bonnell, and I'm the Manager of Public Affairs and Communications for the Legislative Assembly. So I do have a bit of background information about the French translation services that I think will be helpful. So per the Francophone Affairs Secretariat's French Translation Services Manual, translation, revision, proofreading, terminology, and translation coordination services are provided free of charge to all departments of the Government of the Northwest Territories, the Office of the Clerk of the Legislative Assembly, and those bodies cited in the Government Institution Regulations if the document is intended for public use and fits the requirements arising from the GNWT's Strategic Plan on Standards for French Communications and Services. These services are not available to other public institutions, such as municipal governments, non-government organizations, or the public. As MLAs are not part of the executive branch of government, nor the Office of the Clerk, the Francophone Affairs Secretariat charges a fee for translation to and from the French language. The Secretariat has an internal procedure regarding payment. In summary, they have a threshold of $100 to start charging, which is based on the administrative work required to request payment. So this is why you might not always see a charge for translation services. There's a threshold that has to be met for that charge.
Thank you. Ms. Cleveland?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So that's for French language, and then so for Indigenous language interpretation, then I would expect that there's, no kind of threshold that needs to be met, and it's just a standard charge that is made to employees. So I'm wondering if staff can speak to why the transition happened where in the past members were not charged for interpretation, but now are being charged. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Bunnell?
My understanding is that they have always been charged, especially for Indigenous languages. There would not be that threshold as we don't have a GNWT service for that. So my understanding would be that for translation services and any sort of interpretation service provided by what I would call a sole contractor as an interpreter, you would always be charged for that service.
Okay. Any further questions?
Always, Mr. Speaker.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm wondering, we had the opportunity to listen to Minister Archie speak in her traditional language in the House, which was a treat for everybody. And I know that it's not something that we in the House get to hear often, but that everybody really appreciated the time and effort that Minister Archie put into that. So I'm wondering if Minister Archie can speak to if she used translation services for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Archie, you're on the hot seat. No,
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I did. I got translation services, but I had my Department of Infrastructure pay the costs. So that came out of my department's budget. But I mean, I clearly, and I read through MLA's letter, O'Reilly's, and I agree with it. Like I have no questions. I think this is the right thing to do. So for that one, because I went back to my CA and I went back to like, where am I going to cover this? Because I felt it was important as Nugialuit to have even a paragraph in my language. And I felt like, this should be offered for anybody who has, that inherent right to speak whatever language that they believe in. And yeah, so it came out of my budget, but I'm clearly in favor of this request. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Ms. Archie. As I mentioned, we'll be dealing with it in our next item, I'm sure. Those are the types of changes that we could recommend under that item. So if there's no further questions,
Mr. Speaker,
yes.
are you saying yes to me or yes to MLA O'Reilly? We both have our hand up.
I could only see who's talking here.
Oh.
Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that, I completely agree with Minister Archie. If we want members to be able to use language in the House, and I think there's an onus on all members to use all of our official languages in the House. And I think it would be pretty special if we could say at the end of the year that every official language of the Northwest Territories was spoken in the House. But we've even had colleagues of ours express sorrow in the fact that they've lost their ability to speak their traditional language. And this is just an extra tool that allows language to be spoken in the House and to be heard by all people of the Northwest Territories. And I think that it's our responsibility really to support that any way that we can from within our own dealings in the House. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cleveland. Mr. O'Reilly?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Speaker. I just quickly, it's been a long time since I looked at the actual invoices themselves, but I have 3 invoices open on my desktop on one of the screens here. And one is from February 2020. It's for $79. Another is from November of 2020. It's for $59.25. And the last one is dated November of 2020 as well, and it's for $115.50. And they're actually from they sent these the documents, I think 2 member statements and 1 news release to a translation house or firm in Quebec City, and that's who these invoices are actually from. So in any event, a couple of them were actually less than $100. But for me, I guess it's not so much the money, it's the principle of it. But I just thought it would be worthwhile to mention the amounts of these invoices for the discussion. Thanks, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Any more questions or recommendations? But like I mentioned, I think on the next action item, we'll be able to resolve this, and shouldn't be an issue. No further questions? Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. We'll let you know the outcome here shortly. I'm sure we all want the same thing, and have our languages available to everyone. And thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Speaker. Do you want me to exit the call, or
you can stay until we go in camera if you wanted to?
Okay, yeah, and I promise I'm not going to say anything further. And I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you and watch part of the BOM meeting. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Our next action item is 3B, draft response to Standing Committee on Rules and Procedures, report on languages. Attachment 2, Ms. Bonnell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, if anyone has tuned in, my name is Nicole Bonnell, and I'm the Manager of Public Affairs and Communications for the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly. Just to quickly touch on that last item, it would require some changes to regulations and policy, and I would be happy to bring back some recommendations to BOM at its next meeting. So just to touch on that briefly. But now we'll move into the report and action plan on official language use in the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly. Today I'll be running you through that report and action plan. So first, I'll provide context for the rest of the presentation. I'll then talk a bit about the Standing Committee on Rules and Procedures report on Motion 5-19(2, referral of point of privilege raised by member for Montfouille on March 10, 2020. Finally, I will walk through the recommendations of that report and the associated actions to address these recommendations. The Northwest Territories recognizes 11 official languages, 9 of which are Indigenous languages, as well as English and French. The Official Languages Act has recognized Indigenous languages as official since 1990 and provided them equal status within the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly. It has been a priority for the Legislative Assembly to include all official languages into all legislative proceedings to align with reconciliation and Indigenous language revitalization. Within the Office of the Clerk, Public Affairs and Communications, otherwise known as PAC, is responsible for the Assembly's official languages and broadcasting programming. There are a variety of opportunities for official language use within the Legislative Assembly, whether it is through direct service, interpretation, or translation. Interpretation is the translation of spoken or oral speech, and translation is translating a written word. PAC strives to include all official languages in all sessional proceedings and regionally appropriate official languages during committee meetings. In the past, official language use has been unpredictable and inconsistent. However, with PAC's increased capacity in 2021 due to the addition of more members to the unit, the provision of Legislative Assembly services in the NWT's official languages continues to improve. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the associated restrictions on travel and building capacity, PAC has been unable to hire interpreters in all official languages during session. This has had a negative impact on language services provided to the public. Another impeding factor of providing language services for the Legislative Assembly has been the aging population of language service providers, as well as a decreasing number of qualified interpreters within the territory. However, PAC continues to engage with interpreters and establish new relationships with interpreters across the territory. On February 9, 2021, the Standing Committee on Rules and Procedures, otherwise known as SCORP, tabled its report on Motion 5-19(2, referral of point of privilege raised by member for Montfouille on March 10, 2020. As stated in the report, on March 10, 2020, a Clicho language interpreter was not available due to a last-minute cancellation. The interpreter scheduled canceled for personal reasons. The member for Montfouille, Mr. Lafferty, rose on a point of privilege. He said the lack of interpretation impeded or prevented him from performing his parliamentary functions as a member and asked the Speaker to adjourn the proceedings. The Speaker took the matter under advisement and the proceedings continued. On March 11, 2020, when a Clicho language interpreter was available, the Speaker heard debate on the matter of privilege. Following debate, the Speaker ruled that the matter did raise a question of privilege. He entertained motions on the ruling, and Motion 5-19(2 was referred to SCORP for consideration. SCORP's recommendations are outlined in the following slides and accompanied by actions and a status update on progress to date. Recommendation 1 is to update the rules of the Assembly to clearly state the right to use and be understood by other members in any official language when speaking in the Assembly, and the right of members to receive interpretation in any official language. To address this, the rules of the Assembly need to be updated. Rules amendments have been drafted and are ready for caucus review prior to introduction in the Legislative Assembly. With this recommendation in mind, PAC has outlined funding requests for Board of Management consideration as part of the 2022-23 draft main estimates for an increased official languages budget to cover the costs of interpretation services and the travel associated with bringing interpreters to Yellowknife for session. Recommendation 2 is another update to the rules of the Assembly, this time to clearly state that documents in any official language may be tabled in the Assembly. Similar to progress on Recommendation 1, rules amendments have been drafted and are ready for caucus review prior to introduction in the Legislative Assembly. Recommendation 3 deals with simultaneous interpretation of committee proceedings into official languages being made available to members or witnesses. There are 4 actions underway, the first being to create an operational procedure to guide the process of providing simultaneous interpretation of committee proceedings. This is underway with a target completion date of March 2022. The next action is to update and standardize the current active offer to be included in all official documents that are produced by the Legislative Assembly. Standardization of committee correspondence and advertising, including the active offer, is underway with a target completion date of December 2021. The third action involves providing public affairs and communications with 1 week notice if interpretation is needed for a committee meeting. Standardization of committee correspondence and advertising ties into this, as does the operational procedure on committee interpretation. And the 1 week notice for public affairs and communications ties into the need for us to book interpreters, book their travel, and potentially their travel and their payment. The final action for recommendation 2 involves upgrading both in-house and travel equipment required for interpretation. Again, PAC has outlined funding requests for Board of Management consideration to be included in the 2022-23 draft main estimates for the Legislative Assembly. Moving on to recommendation 4, which deals with increasing efforts to provide interpretation into regionally appropriate official languages when standing and special committees hold public meetings in communities outside of the capital. This recommendation has 2 associated actions. The first is to undertake outreach to Indigenous government organizations, bands, towns, and hamlets to better understand their needs in relation to official language use by the Assembly and to form a roster of new interpreters. The letter has been drafted, and we anticipate this action will be complete by mid-December 2021. The next action is to purchase portable interpreting booths for public committee meetings not in the capital and purchase equipment to be used by interpreters when traveling with committees. This has also been outlined as a funding request in the draft main estimates. Recommendation 5 states that should a comparable situation arise in the future, the Speaker give strong consideration to a recess in or adjournment of proceedings until such time as adequate interpretation can be provided. Should this situation arise again, the Speaker will consider the advice from the SCORP report and make a decision based on the advice provided and any other relevant facts. Recommendation 6 speaks to the need for a rights-based official languages policy for the Legislative Assembly before the end of this Assembly. PAC is currently undertaking interjurisdictional research with the goal of presenting a draft policy to the Board of Management in the second quarter of the 2022-23 fiscal year. Following adoption of the new policy, an internal review of official languages programs at the Assembly will occur to ensure consistency with the adopted policy. Should the other recommendations of the SCORP report not be feasible at present, Recommendation 7 outlines the need for a plan to realize the outcomes identified. The report and action plan on official language use in the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly is meant to serve as a broad action plan to respond to the SCORP report. While the SCORP report states that committee recommends that a plan to realize these outcomes be included in the official languages policy, PAC would like to include the policy as part of this action plan instead of the other way around. This allows PAC to undertake the actions listed prior to the completion of a policy, which will not be reviewed by the Board of Management until fall 2022. The second action to address Recommendation 7 is to track interpretation and translation services to track improvements over time. Various statistics have been tracked over the past several years, but the Assembly's Official Languages Coordinator is making a concerted effort to standardize tracking. The final recommendation of the SCORP report deals with the Standing Committee on Government Operations, considering the issues of interpreter and translator training and accreditation, as well as the possibility of a future GNWT Languages Bureau in the context of its review of the Official Languages Act. This is now with SCOGO for consideration. There are a few additional actions that have been identified by PAC to advance official languages programming at the Assembly. The first is to create and implement an official languages orientation program for members and Assembly staff. The Assembly's Official Languages Coordinator is working on this with the aim of offering a session to staff in January 2022. It would then be offered as part of onboarding programs for members and staff. Next, we have planning and scheduling regular professional development workshops for interpreters. These have been offered in the past, but we would like to formalize the requirement through this action plan. The next session is planned for February 2022, pending COVID-19 restrictions. PAC has been working with the Deputy Law Clerk on the creation of a standardized contract for interpreters. It is now complete and will be presented to interpreters at the next professional development session. Next, we would like to continue to develop formal links with the Department of Education, Culture and Employment to advance mutual interests and priorities. PAC has representatives on both the Indigenous Languages Committee and the French Language Services Coordinating Committee and will participate and collaborate whenever possible. And very timely, I just received an email that the Indigenous Languages Committee will be meeting again very shortly, so we will be able to advance this work soon. Finally, we have two mainly internal actions to advance official language program use and assessment within the Assembly. There are a number of long-term internal changes underway to integrate official languages into the everyday work of the Assembly, including translation projects for Assembly room names, audio tours, and a land acknowledgement. This list will expand over time. We would also like to update the Board of Management on progress at least twice annually as part of presentations on the budget and the Assembly's annual report. Public Affairs and Communications is continuously working to enhance official language services at the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly to ensure service levels are exceptional. There is always room for improvement, especially in the area of technology and equipment, as these aspects are constantly evolving. Although we are seeing a decrease in the numbers of qualified interpreters, by taking the recommended steps moving forward, PAC is confident that official languages services being provided can continue. As it is a priority for the current Assembly to ensure that all official languages are used and respected in the legislature's proceedings, this will only help strengthen reconciliation and Indigenous language revitalization. The Office of the Clerk would like to thank Mr. Lafferty and the members of SCORP for their time and commitment to the use of official languages in the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Bunnell. Any questions from the board?
I do.
Go ahead, Ms. Archie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I'm looking at all the recommendations, and it's good recommendations, but is there within each of the different recommendations here? Sorry, I'm just going to find them. Is there like a monetary request in addition to that? Would be my first question.
Thank you, Ms. Bunnell.
Any monetary request would be part of our ask under the draft main estimates that will be discussed later today.
Thank you, Ms. Archie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So we are going to discuss the monetary request as a result of this. I mean, there's a lot of recommendation here, and it really doesn't reflect good on us as an Assembly if we're not, if we're having to deal with this many recommendations. I think maybe, Mr. Speaker, that's just a comment. And when we get to talk about this, I think I'll probably have more questions. But I'm just clearly going to comment that this is, I think I'll speak to it later when we talk about some of the resources required to fulfill all these recommendations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Ms. Cleveland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I do have a couple of questions, and I think, first of all, I think this is very exciting, and I think it's necessary work for the Assembly. And so I'm really happy to see this presentation. I think kudos to Public Affairs. It was really well put together, and I really appreciate the work that they put into it. I think that when we put together kind of an action plan, it's based on when things go right. And so, for example, making sure we have access to interpretation and making sure that, within a week's notice that committees are providing that access or people can request it. But I'm thinking back to some of the travel that even in COVID times we've been able to do as a committee. And I'm wondering, okay, we arrive in Inuvik, we have interpretation set up. What happens when things don't go as expected? What happens if we're all there on the ground ready to go with some public engagement and something happens and we don't have access to that interpreter anymore? Is it canceled and everybody goes home? Does committee have the ability to move forward? And so I'm wondering if within those recommendations, there will be some language around what happens when things don't go right. And so I did see that there's some allowance for yourself and your role as speaker to be able to have that conversation on a case-by-case basis. But what about committees? Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Bunnell?
Thank you. So certainly that would be something we would consider under a rights-based official language policy. That is definitely something we would consider there. As PAC with interpretation, we always try to have a backup plan, and even sometimes the backup plan doesn't work. But we really do try our best to have a few people in each community on the line for different languages. Obviously, we can't predict everything that could happen, but we do try to be prepared for certain cancellations, etc. But that, like I said, would definitely be part of the official languages policy that would be rights-based.
Thank you. Any
Mr.
further
Speaker,
questions?
I have
Yes.
another question. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My next question is in regards to, and I think that Minister Archie lightly touched on this, is the budget associated with this. And one of my questions is around, for example, tabled documents. If the expectation is that anybody can table a document in any official language, which is excellent, but there might not be another version of that document, for example, in English or French or any other language. And so is the onus then on the Legislative Assembly to translate that document, which could be quite a substantial budget increase to the Legislative Assembly, or is there a responsibility to produce an executive summary? And so I'm just wondering if that is also being considered within these recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cleveland. Ms. Bunnell?
Thank you. So certainly with moving to rights-based, a rights-based official languages policy, again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but it would be considered under that policy. And this very much relates to Mr. O'Reilly's previous presentation to us. So it's certainly something that we are looking at. I will confess, I am not quite sure what that looks like yet, but it is something that we're thinking about and something that would, again, be in that policy.
Thank you. I think we're going to have another meeting in person when we have a session here, because there will be a lot of costs linked to this, and I don't think you can't put a price on our languages anyway, but that I think this is one item that we're going to have to all be there in person to just work out everything. It'd be much easier than online here anyway, and just thought I'd throw that in there. And if anybody has any more questions, thank you.
I just have one last question, Mr. Speaker.
Sure.
Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering if Public Affairs would be willing, within the jurisdictional scan for the policy, to also look at jurisdictions outside of Canada and not just jurisdictions within inside Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cleveland. Ms. Bunnell?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, absolutely, that is something that we'll be doing. Interestingly enough, I've already started looking at South Africa, as they are remarkably similar to us. So yes, that is something that we'll be doing.
Thank you. Any further questions? Ms. Archie?
Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just for housekeeping, can we just ask who's all online with us today? Like, I see a bunch of different people that I don't recognize in our gallery. So I mean, it's I think it's important that we know who's all in this meeting with us. Thank you.
Sure. Who can answer that?
Mr. Speaker, it's Danielle Maugre here.
Glenn,
We have in the room, in Committee Room A, we have Mr. Rutland, Mr. Mercer, Ms. Wickens, and Ms. Bunnell, and myself, Danielle. And then online, we have Ms. Archie, yourself, Mr. Speaker, Ms. Cleveland, and Mr. O'Reilly. The other 3 screens that you're seeing are internal screens, one in the broadcasting AV room, one here in the committee room, and one in the booth behind us. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Archie?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So are we live stream right now, as this is a public forum?
Uh,
Well, you
Ms.
should know that.
Margaret? No,
Thank you,
No,
Mr.
we're
Chair.
not.
Yes, we are live. The first 3 items on your agenda are public items. Thank you.
okay.
That would have been good to know probably half hour ago, but anyways.
Any further questions? Seeing none, like I mentioned, we'll have this discussion in person when we go down for session, and I think we need to go through all the budget costs and everything, and we'll make most of our recommendations. And so we'll table this. Moving on to 3C. The missing murdered Indigenous women's monument. We have an update from Ms. Bunnell.
Hi there. In the summer of 2020, the Legislative Assembly's Public Affairs and Communications Unit was tasked with planning and organizing the creation of a monument recognizing the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis. Funding for the project was approved in February 2021 and was organized into phases. The first and most important phase of this project is to consult with family members and of victims of the crisis, as well as Indigenous groups in the Northwest Territories, about what needs to be included and considered with this monument. It is critical that this work be undertaken by a group that understands this issue and the people affected by it. Depending on the needs of the families and groups consulted, the monument could be a place for vigils to be held, a quiet space for reflection, or something entirely different. The vision rests with the needs of the families. In May 2021, the Speaker requested the assistance of the Minister responsible for the status of women, engaging the interest of the Native Women's Association of the Northwest Territories in undertaking consultation with family members and Indigenous groups to determine what needs to be taken into consideration when developing the monument. The Native Women's Association has expressed support for the project and confirmed their willingness to help, for which we are extremely grateful. In the summer of 2021, the Department of Executive and Indigenous Affairs ran 3 preliminary engagement sessions with the Native Women's Association of the NWT, the Status of Women Council, and other community contacts on the MMIWG calls for justice. I attended each session and presented on the Legislative Assembly's plans for the creation of this monument. The main purpose for these presentations was to seek feedback on the idea, potential locations for a monument, and any themes that came to mind for participants. I received a lot of helpful feedback, and participants were open to the idea of a monument located on the legislature precinct. I have recently re-engaged with my contact at the GNWT and expect correspondence in the next week or so to continue with this work and start planning for engagement with the Native Women's Association. I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Mr. Speaker? You got your mute on.
Go ahead, Ms. Archie.
Thank you. So was there an attachment to this? I know we've been talking about it for quite some time, and you know, the importance of the monument and, you know, engaging people, partners to get this done. But I'm sorry, I'm going through our 109-page package here, and I don't see an attachment. So was there, my first question would be, was there an attachment on the progress of where we're at with this?
Thank you, Ms. Bunnell.
No, I just prepared a verbal update.
Ms. Archie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Okay, but we will, once we start going further and, you know, show some progress on this, we'll get updates on where we're at with this, because I mean, we've been talking about it for almost 2 years now, and I'd just like to see some progress on this, because I think this is important. This is something we said we would do as part of this 19th Assembly, And yeah, I'm going to just probably keep asking questions on this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Any further questions?
I have a question, Mr. Speaker.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm wondering if it's possible for our bond meeting during session, our upcoming session here at the end of November, beginning of December, if we can look on kind of a timeline, and with the understanding that we know that things come up, but some kind of timeline that would see us being able to see this project through in the life of this assembly. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Any further questions? Seeing none, we'll table this for our next in-person meeting as well to get a timeline of all the actions being taken. Okay, we'll just call a, well, first we'll move to go in camera and then we'll take a 5-minute break. Do we have a mover to go in camera?
Diane and I both have our hands up, but I'm guessing you can't. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. We are now in camera. We'll take a 5-minute break. Staff just need a little time to get set up here. Thank you.